Bloomin' Cheesy here. This is the second part of the book reading for Peter Pan, 1994 remade Disney version. Hope you guys do like it. Hope you guys do comment right down below. And I hope you guys do subscribe. You, right there. George turned, promptly tripped over Nana, and smacked into the dresser, sending everything on it crashing to the floor. Poor Nana, cried Mary and the children as they rushed past him to see if Nana was all right. George was dumbfounded. Poor Nana? Cried George in disbelief. That's the last straw. George jumped to his feet and grabbed Nana by the collar. And there'll be no more dogs for nursemaids in this house, either. The children cried and protested desperately, but it was no use. When their father was angry, he never listened to reason. They waved and said farewell as George dragged Nana from the nursery. Dash it all, Nana, George complained. Don't look at me like that. It's nothing personal. George felt miserable as he tied Nana to the post in the backyard. It's just that you're not really a nurse at all. You're a dog. And the children aren't puppies. They're people. And the sooner or later, people have to grow up. Upstairs in the nursery, Mary tucked the boys into the bed and sat at her daughter's bedside. But I don't want to grow up, Wendy insisted sadly. Now, dear, said her mother gently as she pulled up the covers and kissed her daughter on the forehead. Don't worry any more about it tonight. He called Peter Pan absolute poppycock, John said. Set her son's glasses and parrot bandana on the nightstand. I'm sure he didn't mean it. Your father was just upset. Poor Nana, sniffled Michael, out there all alone. No more tears, Michael, said his mother softly. It's a warm night. She'll be all right. Mary went to the window and started to close it. Please don't lock it, Wendy called out from her bed. He might come back. He? Asked her mother. Peter Pan, Wendy said. You see, I found something that belongs to him. And what's that? Mary asked. His shadow, Wendy yawned, and her eyes grew heavy with sleep. Nana had it, but I took it away. Yes, of course, her mother smiled. Now, good night, dear. She turned off the light and slipped quietly out. A few minutes later, Mary and George Darling were on the way to the party. George wore a top hat and carried a cane. His wife wore a cape. Do you think the children will be safe without Nana? Mary asked. Why wouldn't they be? George replied. Well, Wendy said something about a shadow. Shadow? Her husband replied. Whose shadow? Peter Pan's, said Molly. Peter Pan's? George frowned. Oh, Mary, of all the childish fiddle-faddle. There must have been someone, his wife insisted. George threw up his hands in aspiration. How can we expect the children to grow up and be practical when we're as bad as they are? he complained angrily. No wonder Wendy has these wild ideas. Of course, her husband was right. Mary Darling thought all this talk of the shadows and Peter Pan was just what her husband had said it was. Fiddle faddle. Just childish nonsense. Mary sighed as she took her husband's arms. It is a pity, though, she admitted. She had rather liked the idea of Peter Pan. More fantastic artwork. I love this original artwork pieces. No sooner had George and Mary Darling turned the corner on that Peter Pan flew out the sky and alighted to the small swimming pixie named Tinkerbell. Peter wore forest green clothes and a green cap with an orange feather. He waited until the Darlings were out of sight, then made sure Nana was asleep in the yard before he jumped down to the nursery window. All three children were asleep in their beds, so Peter and Tinkerbell slipped inside. Peter pointed to the doghouse. Look there, Tink. Tinkerbell flew into the doghouse, then came out and shook her head. Darn! Peter glanced around the room. It must be here somewhere. His eyes settled on the toy chest, and they flew over to have a look. Meanwhile, Tinkerbell found a pretty music box and opened it. Lovely music floated into the air. Stop playing, said Peter a bit harshly. Help me find my shadow. Stung by Peter's tone, Tinkerbell ignored him and flew up to admire herself in a mirror. She heard a rattling sound come from a nearby drawer and peeked through the keyhole. The shadow was inside. Tinkerbell jingled for Peter's attention. Peter rushed over and yanked open the drawer. The shadow leapt out. Come back here, Peter cried. He slammed the drawer shut, accidentally trapping Tinkerbell inside. The shadow dashed up the wall, and Peter flew after it. The shadow scooted across the ceiling and down the far wall. Where it tried to hide behind a chair. Oh, drink. Okay. Peter dove after it, knocking over the soap stand and waking Wendy. She sat up in bed and rubbed her eyes. Peter Pan, she gasped. Wendy hopped out of bed and ran to Peter. I knew you'd come back, she jabbered excitedly. I saved your shadow for you. I do hope it isn't rumpled. Peter backed into the corner. He wanted to escape, but he couldn't until the shadow was firmly reattached. He grabbed the soap from the stand and rubbed it on his feet, hoping to get his shadow to stick. You know, you look exactly the way I thought you would, Wendy ran on breathlessly. Then she realized what he was trying to do and took the soap away. No, silly. You can't stick it on with soap. It needs sewing. She marched across the room to her dresser and took out her sewing kit. Of course, I knew it was your shadow the minute I saw it. And I said to myself, I'll put it away for him until he comes back. She smiled at Peter. I know you'd come back after all. No one can leave his shadow laying around and not miss it sooner or later. Peter scratched his head. He never heard anyone rattle on like so. Wendy opened her sewing kit and started to thread a needle. What I still don't understand is how Nana got your shadow in the first place. She really isn't vicious, you know, and she's a wonderful nurse. Although Father says girls talk too much. Peter blurted out. Embarrassed, Wendy put down the needle. Well, yes, I do sometimes. But don't stop sewing, girl, Peter said. My name isn't Girl, Wendy replied, picking up her needle and commencing to sew. It's Wendy, Moria, Angela, Dar. Peter put up his hand. Wendy's enough, he said rather rudely. Wendy, however, was far too curious to be offended by his bad manners. She wanted to know more about Peter. How did Nana get your shadow? She asked excitedly. She jumped at me the other night, Peter said, at the window. What were you doing there? Wendy asked as she sewed. I came to listen to the stories, Peter said. My stories? Wendy said with surprise. But they're all about you. Of course, Peter said without a trace of modesty. That's why I like 'em. I tell them to the Lost Boys. Wendy finished her sewing and broke off the thread. Oh, yes, the Lost Boys are your men. That's right. Peter hopped off the bed and studied his shadow against the wall. Wendy had sewn it on quite tightly, and then it wasn't about to get away again. I'm so glad you came tonight, Wendy said. I may never have seen you. Why? Asked Peter, who was still admiring his shadow. Wendy turned away and sighed. Because I have to grow up tomorrow, she said. Peter spun around, shocked. Grow up? Wendy nodded sadly. Tonight's my last night in the nursery. That means no more stories, Peter said. I know, Wendy said in a sniff. Peter was incensed. No, I won't have it. He grabbed her hand and led her across the room. Come on. Wendy blinked uncomprehendingly. Where are we going? She asked. Neverland, said Peter. He pulled her to the open window. You'll never grow up there. Oh, Peter, that would be wonderful, Wendy gasped. But before he could pull her out the window, she stopped. Wait, what would Mother say? That's how far I went for part 2. Hope you guys do like. Hope you guys do comment. Hope you guys do subscribe.